Hello everybody, in this video I'm basically going to walk you through Assessment 8, which you're going to find is essentially a sort of ideological quiz that gives you the opportunity to apply some of the lessons from this week's reading material and lecture material to yourself in order to gain a better understanding of your own ideological predispositions. Now, to begin with, you can access this assessment in the same exact way that you would access any other assessment. Go to the coursework folder for this week during the corresponding time identified by your course schedule, and then access the actual assessment on Blackboard. Select the attached Word document, and it should download, right? So double click that document and then open it up, and what you should see is what's currently on the screen. Right, now once you've gotten the document open, there are a couple of options. The first option, and my recommendation, is for you to complete this assessment directly in the Word document. The second option is for you to print it off and to complete it manually. Now, if you do decide to complete this manually, make sure that before you print the document, you clear the 4 text boxes that actually appear directly on the chart that you see here on the first page of the assessment. You're going to need to do that in order to make room for you to manually write the names of the appropriate ideologies into the provided spaces. At the same time, right, you will need to make sure that when it comes time to identify whether a statement is either social or economic, you circle the corresponding answer. If you complete this assessment directly in the Word document, instead of circling the correct answer, simply delete the incorrect answer. So if you think statement 1 is an economic statement or that it deals with an economic issue and you're completing it directly in the document, what you need to do is delete the words social or, so that all that remains within the parentheses is going to be economic, right? Okay, let's go ahead and assume that you want to complete this assessment directly in the Word document. Again, this is probably the easiest way to accomplish your goals, and in addition to that, it's the easiest format for me to grade. So the first step you're going to need to take upon downloading this document is writing your name. Note that this is a header, so you're going to need to double click up here in the top portion of the page, and then you can type your name directly in front of the word name. In my case, that's going to be Connor Alford. Once you're done, double-click anywhere else in the document, and you will be removed from the header. Your name will appear here, but notice that it will not appear on any of the other pages. That's exactly the way I want it. I do not need to see your name 3 separate times. Once you've written your name, the next step is to read the directions. I'm going to walk you through most of this in this video, but it's important for you to peruse that content in any case. In addition to which, be aware that there is a sort of disclaimer down here at the bottom. We'll talk about that shortly. In the meantime, as per the directions, what you're going to find is that this chart on page 1 is basically meant to parallel the 4-cornered ideological grid discussed in your textbook. So just like the 4-cornered ideological grid that is discussed in your textbook and that we talked about in lecture, we're going to have 2 separate axes. The vertical axis going from top to bottom is going to be our economic axis. Where the numbers are positive, we find that there will be more control. So at the top of this chart, where the numbers are positive on the economic axis, we find 2 separate quadrants, which both, generally speaking, believe that the government should exert more control over our economic affairs. At the bottom, on the bottom half of this chart, where the economic numbers are negative, we find 2 quadrants which represent ideologies that, generally speaking, believe the government should exert less control over our economic affairs. We also have a social axis, which runs horizontally from left to right across the chart. On the left side of this chart, where the numbers on the social axis are negative, we have 2 quadrants representing ideologies that believe that there should be less social control. On the right side, where the social axis numbers are positive, we have 2 quadrants representing ideologies that believe that there should be more social control. Your first task on this assignment is to use this information to label each of the appropriate quadrants according to the corresponding ideology. So I'll go ahead and do the first one for you. We'll start in this top right quadrant. Now, we find that in the top right quadrant, in this portion here, the economic numbers are going to be positive. So we know that this ideology, generally speaking, favors more government control over our economic affairs, right? At the same time, we find that the numbers in this top right quadrant on the social axis are also going to be positive, indicating that this quadrant, in addition to favoring more economic control, also tends to favor more control over our social interactions. Well, based on that information, what we know is that this quadrant is what I described in lecture as the quadrant for statists, right? The ideology, which tends to believe in more economic and more social control, can be referred to as the statist ideology or the authoritarian ideology. Or, to use the language from your textbook, you can just label this economic liberals, social conservatives, right? Again, the simplest way to label this would simply be to write statist. And I'll accept any of those answers, authoritarian, statist, or economic liberal, social conservative. But statist is the most simple, right? Now you're going to need to do the exact same thing with these other three quadrants, right? Each of these quadrants represents one of the three major ideologies in American politics. So in each of these boxes, you're either going to write liberal, conservative, or libertarian. But you need to make sure that whatever ideology you type into the box corresponds to that appropriate quadrant, right? So you would not want to type liberal here because liberals do not, generally speaking, believe that we should have more government control over social interactions, right? So we know that the answer for this box is not liberal, it's statist, because only statists believe both A, that the government should exert more control over our economic interactions, and B, that the government should also exert more control over our social interactions, right? So step one is to correctly label each of these quadrants according to the corresponding ideology. If you don't understand this, more likely than not, you need to go back and watch the lecture and read the assigned readings for this week, right? So go ahead and label each of these four boxes. The top right box is statist, and you need to figure out which of the remaining three boxes corresponds to which of the three major ideologies in American politics. Again, that's libertarianism, liberalism, and conservatism, right? Now, if you find later on when it comes time to move your indicator here in the middle that the text boxes are in the way, you are perfectly free to move the text box, right? Just make sure that each of the labels remains within its corresponding quadrant. So, for example, don't take the statist text box and place it over here. That's not going to work, and you're going to lose points for that. Keep the statist quadrant somewhere within the top right, okay? So once you've done that, the next step is to scroll down and to begin looking at each of these statements. The 8 statements listed on page 1 each correspond to a contemporary political issue, which is either social or economic in nature. Your first job upon completing the quadrants, upon labeling the quadrants of our chart, is to figure out which of these statements deals with an economic issue and which of these statements deals with a social issue. Thinking back to lecture, keep in mind, economic issues are those in which government action entails some kind of interaction or control over our economic behaviors, the way you spend your money, the way you run your business, what sort of employment contracts you enter into. Economic issues deal with your financial interactions. How do you spend your money, or how does your business spend its money when it interacts with other people, right? Social issues, on the other hand, entail government involvement in our social or cultural interactions with other individuals. So I'll go ahead and do the first two for you. The first of these statements stipulates that the government should restrict same-sex marriage, right? Well, what we're going to find is that marriage isn't really an economic transaction. It's not really a financial interaction, or at least I hope it's not. I suppose in some cases when you've got like prenups involved, it can become economic, but generally speaking, that's clearly not what we're looking for, right? So in this case, right, we're dealing with a social issue. I'm going to go ahead and delete or economic because I'm completing the assessment directly in the Word document. So I have now identified that statement 1 is a social issue. You need to do the same thing, okay? So statement 1 is a social issue. Statement 2 stipulates that the government should require a higher national minimum wage, right? Well, again, we are in this case looking at finances, right? A minimum wage. We are basically stipulating in this statement that the government should exert more control over your financial affairs. When you say that the government should require a higher national minimum wage, what you're basically saying is that businesses should not be able to enter into employment contracts with employees where those employees are paid less than a certain amount. Similarly, at the same time, we're going to find that you're also telling those employees what sorts of employment contracts they can sign. When you say that we should have a minimum wage of $15 an hour, what you mean is that the government should prevent American citizens from entering into employment contracts where they are being paid less than $15 an hour. Now, maybe they want to work that way, but again, the idea of a minimum wage is for the government to exert some form of economic control, some sort of control over our financial and economic contracts, agreements, and interactions with other individuals and institutions in society. So this is clearly going to be an economic issue. Now again, I have identified this as an economic issue by deleting the incorrect answer, so that the only word remaining within the parentheses is economic. Again, this is what you'll need to do if you want to receive credit. So that helps us to identify the first two issues. On your own, you'll go through and you'll do the exact same thing for each of these different problems. Now again, if you decide to print this off and complete it manually, simply circle which answer you think is correct, right? So if you think that the next one is an economic issue, go ahead and use your pen or pencil to circle the word economic. If you think it's a social issue, use your pen or pencil to circle the word social, right? Once you've done this, the next step is for you to assign a number from this spectrum to each of the issues according to how much you agree with that statement, right? So, for example, statement 1 says the government should restrict same-sex marriage. Let's say that I am vehemently opposed to this, that I just really think that's a bad idea. I would put a -3, right? That means that I strongly disagree on this bar. Now, if you're completing this manually with a pencil, simply write it into the space. If, on the other hand, you are typing this in, what you'll want to do is type your answer on the space and then underline it, right? If you underline it, that will look just fine to me. The easiest way to do this is before you begin typing, hold the control key and then hit U. Then put -3. On the other hand, let's say that I actually really strongly agree with this statement. In that case, I would, again, hit and hold control, then hit U and type my answer, 3. If you would prefer to just delete these lines altogether and simply put your answer next to the appropriate statement, that's also okay. Just make sure that it's clear which of these numbers you have selected for which of the corresponding statements, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and say that I strongly agree with statement 1 and I somewhat agree with statement 2. In that case, right, I would put a 3 for statement 1 and a 2 for statement 2. When you complete this, you'll go ahead and put in your own opinions, right? So You will designate a number to each of these statements according to the degree to which you agree or disagree. Use this chart. Use these numbers. Do not select numbers that are not on this chart, or you will lose points for failing to follow instructions, right? Again, -3 for strongly disagree, all the way up to +3 for strongly agree. 0 is for issues that you have no opinion on. Do not put 0 for every single one of these issues. If you're unfamiliar with what an issue entails, you need to do some research on your own. So for example, if you don't know what is meant by physician-assisted suicide, you need to speak with some people that you trust in your life. You need to go online and you need to do some research to figure out what exactly that entails, so that you can formulate an informed opinion with which to complete this assignment. Failing to do so will make it more difficult for you to provide meaningful answers to the questions on the next page, and in addition to that, will rob you of a portion of the learning experience. Okay, so you figured out for each of these statements the extent to which you agree or disagree, right? What we're going to find then is that the next step for you is to use these numbers. Again, make sure that you haven't simply put 0 for all of them. You will lose credit for that, right? Make sure that you have numbers next to all of these. And then use those numbers to move the indicator on the chart. The indicator is this red circle here, right? Now, if you're going to complete this assessment manually by printing, you won't be able to move the indicator, in which case, click it and hit backspace before you print so that you don't have that in the way. Then mark on the chart with your pen your starting point here at coordinates 0, 0. This is at 0 on the economic axis and it's at 0 on the social axis, right? This is your starting point whether you're completing the assessment manually or you are completing it on the actual Word document. So we're going to start here and then we're going to move our indicator along the respective axes of this chart according to the numbers we've assigned to each of the issues. So again, this first issue we identified as a social issue. That means that we're going to be moving the indicator along the social axis 3 times, right? I've put 3 for strongly agree, which means that I need to move 3 towards the right on the social axis. If I had put -3, I would need to move 3 towards the left because my numbers should be getting smaller. So when we're talking about social issues, positive numbers move us right and negative numbers move us left, right? Okay, then let's move our indicator. 1, 2, 3. I leave the indicator there. Then I go down to the next statement. The government should require a higher minimum wage. Again, this is an economic issue, so we know that we're going to be moving along the economic axis. We're either going to go up for positive numbers or down for negative numbers. In this case, we have another positive number. We have a 2 for agree. So I'm going to take my indicator where I left it, and I'm going to move it up 1, 2. So I am now currently sitting at coordinates 2, 3. 2 on the economic axis, 3 on the social axis. You'll continue to do this for each of the following issues, and then you're going to need to record your endpoint. So if you're doing this manually, make sure that you keep track of where you're going so that you don't lose track of your position. But the only point that matters is the very last point of your indicator after you have moved it for each of these statements, right? So let's say that on the next social issue, I didn't care. On the next economic issue, I didn't care. But then little by little, let's say I disagree 1 for the next social issue. I would take myself from here and I would go 1 left, right? I somewhat disagree. If on the next economic issue, I said I somewhat disagree again, I would go down 1 because that's -1, right? Go ahead and figure out after you have moved your indicator for each of the respective statements which of the 4 quadrants you land in. That's going to tell you what your ideology is. In this case, I've wound up in the statist quadrant. So if these were my opinions, that would make me a statist. Keep in mind this is simply for the purposes of examples, but again, if this is where I ended up, I would know that I'm a statist. Now, in this case, I'm really close to the axis, right? I am really close to the cutoff point between the top right and the bottom right. So the way that you would write this up when it comes time to answer number 1 is you would say, I am a statist. Then on answer 2, you would say, yes, I am leaning towards the blank ideology. You're going to fill in this blank with the same label that you put here, right? So figure out which ideology is represented by the bottom right quadrant in order to correctly answer these questions, right? Now, in addition to that, it's important for you to understand that you can determine whether or not you have tendencies towards a certain ideology based on how close you come to the axis dividing your quadrant from the quadrant identifying that ideology. So let's go ahead and say that this is communism. That's the incorrect answer. The correct answer is either going to be conservatism, libertarianism, or liberalism. But let's say for the sake of our example that I wanted to label this communism. My answer to number 2 would be that I am a statist with communist tendencies. And I know that I have communist tendencies because I am only one tick away from the social axis, which separates the statists from whichever ideology belongs here. Right? So if you are one tick away from the axis, then you know that you are a member of the ideology represented by your quadrant with tendencies towards the ideology represented by the adjacent quadrant. Okay? So, again, that's how we're going to be able to answer the questions on page 2. It is therefore critically important that you correctly label all of the quadrants and that you correctly identify all of these issues. Think carefully because making one mistake can have some sweeping ramifications that will cause you to lose further points later on, in addition to the points you immediately lose by, for example, misidentifying the first statement as an economic issue. Okay? If your indicator winds up directly on a line, if, for example, this is my endpoint, then what I would do for question 1 is say my ideology straddles the line between statist and whatever ideology I've identified for this quadrant, right? I've never had and am not certain that it's possible to correctly complete this sheet and find yourself at exactly 0, 0. But if you ever did find that you went full circle and wound up back here, that would mean that you have no ideology. You don't really have any strong tendencies in any one direction along either the economic or social axis, right? So again, if you're within one tick of any axis, that tells you that you're a member of the quadrant that your indicator ends up in with tendencies towards the nearest quadrant that is not a part of your ideological group, right? If you wind up directly on an axis, it means that your ideology straddles the line between the ideologies represented by each of the respective quadrants that the indicator is touching, right? Okay, so you're going to go ahead and go through this entire process, complete the sheet, record the last point that your indicator ends up at, and then down here somewhere, go ahead and write in your end quadrants if you are physically completing this assignment. Otherwise, what you're going to do is come down here and you're going to tell me what your ideology is. In this case, statist. In addition to that, I want you to give me your indicator, your coordinates. You can go ahead and write your coordinates here if you're completing this manually as well. But let's say, for example, that I ended at 3 on the social axis and 3 on the social axis. My coordinates should then be 3, 3, and I should put those in parentheses, right? You're going to want to answer each of these questions using the information garnered through your completion of this diagram. Once you have answered all of these questions, You're basically done. But there are last few points that I need to make before I end this video, right? First, for questions 1 and 2, you don't have to write complete sentences. If you just want to put statist 3, 3, that's okay. If you just want to put, for this one, no, I do not straddle any axes or have moderate tendencies, right? In that case, that's fine. You don't have to put anything more than that, right? You can just put no. Or you could put yes. Now, if you do say yes, you're going to need to explain which ideology. So in the example I gave above, I am a statist with some communist tendencies, right? That's what I would write for that, and that would be fine. Nothing more is necessary. For question 3, however, you're going to want to go a step further. On question 3, I need to have some complete answers, right? Some complete sentences and full thoughts. More specifically, I'm going to need at least 3, and no more than 5, complete sentences providing an answer to number 3. Your answer here should show familiarity with the content discussed in lecture, and in addition to that, you should spend some time thinking about it, right? Give me evidence that you've spent some time thinking about this assignment, thinking about the nature of the respective ideologies that we've discussed, and that you're providing meaningful answers. Don't just scribble something down to complete the assignment. Again, there is a final disclaimer, right? I want everyone to be aware that I'm not going to grade you based on where you wind up on this ideological quiz. I'm not going to judge you or give you a grade based on how you have answered or responded to any of these statements in terms of the extent to which you agree or disagree. I am going to grade you according strictly to this rubric, right? The rubric will appear on page 3, and that's all that really matters. I will not remember any of your ideologies upon completing this assessment. I have a lot of American government students, and the purpose here isn't for me to learn about your political beliefs. The purpose here is for you to learn about your political beliefs and for you to have an opportunity to exercise your analytical thinking skills by actively applying lessons from lecture and from the reading to yourself, right? So I'm not going to judge you or grade you according to your ideology or your political beliefs. There will be no discrimination. However, that being said, if you are really uncomfortable sharing your views, I've decided to go ahead and give you an out. As per this footnote, what you're allowed to do if you do not want to share your own views on any of these issues is to go to ontheissues.org, look up a prominent politician, and then assume the role of that politician in answering these questions. You should inform the way you respond to each of these issues, the extent to which you say that your politician agrees or disagrees with the issue, based on that politician's profile on the issues, where you can learn a whole bunch about their public statements about each of these issues, as well as a great deal about their voting record. Use that to inform your decisions. If you decide to go this route, you do have a little bit of extra work that you need to complete. You're going to need to tell me what politician you are looking at, giving me a name and a position. So, for example, if you wanted to use Bernie Sanders, you would write the name Bernie Sanders, comma, United States Senator, former Democratic presidential candidate, or something to that nature. I need to know who you are actually taking the quiz as. Then what I need you to do is to go ahead and copy the actual URL to the profile for this politician on the issues. Understand that I'm going to look over that politician's profile, and if, for example, you say that Bernie Sanders strongly disagrees or strongly agrees with the idea that the government should restrict same-sex marriage, I know that you probably haven't actually looked over any of his statements or voting records on that issue because that's just not true, right? So if you do this, you've got a little bit of extra research that you have to do, but it's an option that I'm going to make available to you in case you are insecure about your own political beliefs or you're uncomfortable sharing them with your professor. You do not have to. That component, the use of your own ideology to complete this assignment, is completely optional, right? So again, the easiest way to do this is just to provide, right, your own opinion, but you don't have to. You may choose to do so to save yourself some work, but that's up to you. All right. That more or less summarizes the assignment. Remember that there is a Blackboard forum, so if you have any questions, if you're having any troubles with this, feel free to go ahead and post them on the questions forum on the discussion board. At the same time, I can be reached via email, so on and so forth. Good luck with the assignment. I look forward to seeing your answers. Y'all have a nice day.